Part 2, Chapter 7. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed how he had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when they're visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say "hush" this time, but said, merely a trifle, it isn't really finished." So she's complimenting his house, and he's being very humble, which means like taking a compliment very nicely and not being braggy about it, I guess. Above the dam there ought to have been a deep pool, but of course now a level of dark green ice, and below the dam, much lower down, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, it was all frozen into foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along the very moment when the frost came. And when the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle and partly on top of the dam was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from the hole in the roof was smoke going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river was another small river which came down to a small valley to join it, and looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he thought almost sure that those were the two small hills in which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamppost the other day. And then between them he thought there must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And then he thought about Turkish delight and about being king, and I wonder how Peter would like that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came into his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver. "It looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip." At the top of the dam it was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered in ice, and though the frozen pool was on level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop on the lower side of the river. Along this route Mr. Beaver led them in single file out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down, and when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve." They all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed when she went in was a burrowing sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. It was from that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding both her wrinkled paws. She's holding them out, not to her face. Holding out both of her old wrinkled paws. "At last! To think I should ever live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish." "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool where he had a little hole in the ice which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind being so chilly. Looked hard into it, and then shot down his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he whisked out a beautiful trout. He did it over and over again until they had a nice catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from the barrel which stood in one corner of the house and to put on the frying pan and get it dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, like on a board ship, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof. And against the wall were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and shovels and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Goodness, that was a lot to say, and it's a lot of descriptiveness, and you might be getting a little lost and bored, but have you ever been inside a beaver's house? You haven't. So this author is trying to tell you what he thinks it would look like, okay? So if you need to listen again, go ahead and rewind it just so that you can kind of get a picture of where these kids are. And I have pictures for you too. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying it, and how hungry the children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was only three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, Mr. Beaver sucked a beer, and the great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as they wanted to go with his potatoes. And the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been done half an hour ago and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. It's meaning this fresh dinner is very good. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle to the fire so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back on their stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment, which means they're all feeling full and happy. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling up his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, he won't find any tracks." Ooh. Okay, let's go to the pictures. This is a dark one, but it's a far away view of the Beaver's house and the river. You can kind of see everything's frozen. And then the one I started off with is, see how they described it? It kind of looks like a beehive. I don't know. But, oh, I think that this might be the door to get in there. But remember they say the smoke's coming out and the kids were getting hungrier and hungrier. So these pictures on the back is one from the movie and then one from the animated version. They're both pretty cool. So here's the kids sitting around the table with the beavers, and you can see their nice meal. And then this one is a little bit better. You can see both beavers. You can see what the inside of their house looks like. Remember, he says there's hanging stuff everywhere, all this stuff on the walls. Here's her rocking chair, three-legged stool, shovel. So that one's very detailed into everything that the author mentions. So I guess they're going to have a discussion. That's it for chapter 7, and now you can go into the questions, okay?